Lots of people say not to judge a book by its cover, but this mindset can create an interesting dichotomy when trying to review games. Growing up, I wasn't in a position to discern good from bad because I could only play what was available to me. If a game was difficult, I just had to play it until I understood what the game wanted, because we weren't always in a position to get a different game. I'm not ignorant to the fact that these circumstances and the resulting refusal to write a game off as bad can turn into a kind of Stockholm syndrome. When you put such a significant amount of time into a game, you may accept its shortcomings and potentially conclude that the game wasn't bad, you just weren't playing it right. Even with this being in my nature, it was difficult to look past the shortcomings of ANNO Mutationem. Ultimately, the game failed to captivate with anything besides the graphical style, and finishing the game left me feeling grateful to be able to move on to something else. In ANNO Mutationem, you play as Anne Flores, a young woman who appears to have lived with some unknown illness for her whole life. You learn that Anne has moved away from home to set out on her own and is routinely visiting a doctor to help identify a treatment for her illness. After a routine check-in with her doctor, Anne pays a visit to her family and discovers that her brother, Ryan, has left the house, but no one in the family has heard from him for a long time. During her visit, Anne learns that a local gang is searching for Ryan, and she sets out to find her brother, which serves as the narrative through point for the game. Visually, ANNO Mutationem is striking, with an interesting blend of three-dimensional assets that caught my interest along with the anime cyberpunk aesthetic. All characters exist as fairly detailed pixel art renders, while all environments are rendered as three-dimensional assets. ANNO Mutationem is effectively divided into two-dimensional combat segments and three-dimensional exploration segments. These segments often seamlessly transition with one another, and are great examples of interesting perspectives the unique graphical style is capable of delivering. The combat in ANNO Mutationem is a side-scrolling hack-and-slash style, where you're able to jump and dodge roll while dispatching enemies with three weapons at Anne's disposal: a light weapon, a heavy weapon, and a ranged weapon. Initially, Anne is limited to a sword and a pistol, but there are additional weapons that are unlocked as the game progresses. Some stronger enemies have an armor bar that doubles as a kind of stamina gauge. When an enemy has armor, damage taken is split between health and armor. When the armor is reduced to zero, enemies are staggered and vulnerable to an admittedly poorly named instant kill, which acts more as a highly damaging attack that doesn't always reduce health to zero. After recovering, the enemy's armor bar begins to refill, but they still take full health damage until their armor is fully restored. Sprinkled throughout some of these combat areas are platforming sections that provide a mild engagement of carefully navigating rooms and solving platforming puzzles, but these sections are clearly rudimentary and not the focus of the game. As you defeat enemies, Anne gains Grom bits and Grom upgrade points that can be spent to unlock nodes in a talent tree. Grom bits are spent to unlock combat techniques that add more abilities to Anne's arsenal, and Grom upgrade points are spent on character upgrades such as increasing attack, health, and inventory space. For the first few hours of the game, I was under the impression that you could only purchase talent upgrades at specific save points, because not all save points had an upgrade talents option. However, I did eventually learn that you can upgrade your talents at any point in the main character user interface. This relatively small inconsistency in the game experience wasn't anything to be upset about, but it did act as the turning point to what ultimately felt like watching ANNO Mutationem come apart at the seams as I continued to play. Combat ends up feeling very one-dimensional, where it's almost always most effective to roll behind the enemy, wail on them until they turn around, and repeat until their health is zero. There is a parry talent that can be unlocked, but this just adds a third step of parrying the attack when the enemy turns around, before rolling and repeating. There are other inconsistencies with the user experience, such as having 3 different weapon slots that can be equipped in the loadout UI, but you're also able to hot swap between all of the weapons in your inventory using the right thumbstick. ANNO Mutationem also suffers from odd pacing, both narratively and progressively, where you spend the first few hours of the game focused on exploring non-combat areas, slowly gathering resources, before the game quickly begins to throw large numbers of upgrade points at you as you engage with combat areas. The stat upgrades are also poorly paced because there are 3 levels of each stat boost, but the third and final level makes up almost half of the overall stat progression. On the normal difficulty, this resulted in a strange hyper-scaling halfway through the game that, coupled with the reskinned and reused enemy types, effectively removed any semblance of a challenge from the combat. There are also crafting and weapon modification systems, but they can only be engaged through a workshop NPC. Every area is filled with boxes that contain a surprising variety of junk items that can either be dismantled into crafting resources or exclusively sold for money. However, these systems went largely ignored in my playthrough, and I never felt the need to engage with these systems no matter how forward-facing they appeared to be. I could often just buy a weapon that was stronger than what I could craft, and these junk items don't impact usable inventory space. The items just go into a separate, bottomless pocket in your inventory where they would remain ignored unless I happened to find a crafting NPC. Another thing that became increasingly prevalent was how often ANNO Mutationem crossfades to black to play a scripted sequence or cutscene. Part of the reason this became so noticeable was because there are outfits that I had unlocked by purchasing the collector's edition of the game. Any scripted sequence with voice dialogue appeared to be a pre-recording, because Anne would often suddenly be wearing her default outfit regardless of what I had equipped. Some instances of specific animations also only had animated sprites with a specific outfit, resulting in Anne randomly changing clothes before snapping back into the previous outfit when the scene ended. Further exacerbating this was the fact that combat areas default to Anne wearing a specific combat suit regardless of your selected outfit. While this doesn't necessarily affect the gameplay in any way, it was confusing and immersion breaking to the point that I just decided to ignore the extra cosmetics. But these small user experiences pale in comparison to the writing and tonal issues that are prevalent in ANNO Mutationem. I will take the time here to say the next section contains spoilers for the main story. While I will do my best not to go into explicit details, I will touch on narrative elements. You have been warned. During Anne's search for her brother, there are cutscenes that hint at a greater machination occurring behind the scenes that potentially threatens the world. However, Anne's narrative focus is only ever on finding her brother Ryan. Nothing that Anne does in her search for Ryan informs or contextualizes what seems to be looming in the background. These are effectively separate narratives that 2/3 through the game are suddenly smashed together in a manner that feels like a desperate attempt to work towards some kind of conclusion. As more and more events occur, they begin to feel increasingly disconnected and are sometimes given a confusing amount of screen time. The game starts as an adventure in a cyberpunk world, but by the end of the game includes elements of magic, interdimensional travel, and the supernatural that don't make much of an effort to relate to one another in a meaningful way. All the while, Anne doesn't really seem to be interested in anything that's going on, and even going into the point of no return is still operating solely on reuniting with her brother. There are text logs and emails throughout the game that technically and occasionally hint toward exposition, but almost none of that information is ever explicitly mentioned through the narrative. There's even a case where the game tries to pull the "everything you've experienced has been monitored and orchestrated" card, but it doesn't make sense within the context of how these events occurred. Often, ANNO Mutationem will introduce a conflict with something or someone with zero context, resolve that conflict, and hurriedly attempt to provide contextual information before immediately discarding it. The biggest sin was going into the final boss fight, you have an option to ask an NPC a question, and they literally give you, in text, the entire backstory about the events that shaped the world into its current state. This steady decay into a confusing mess was honestly disappointing, because in the first third of the game, ANNO Mutationem does create a world that is compelling and begs to be explored. However, none of that potential is properly utilized, and elements that could have been explored deeper fall victim to the same rushed explanation and dismissal that plagues the narrative from the middle to the end. As I spent more time in the game, ANNO Mutationem began to feel like a finished graphical engine that was behind schedule and ended up rushed out the door. While it is visually impressive, ANNO Mutationem ultimately reveals itself to be a shallow, confusing amalgamation of ideas and systems that are common in video games, but don't serve a meaningful purpose within the context of this one. I'd honestly say that outside of the visuals, ANNO Mutationem offers very little worth experiencing. Thanks for watching, take care, and remember, keep having fun.